I'm just stunned across the board. You?
I thought we were going to have I thought they were going to have a conversation, which we would follow up on, in part on criminal justice reform, sentencing, and prisons, which is, by the way, a bipartisan, really important idea. That was mostly nonsense, but there were some things in there that probably are worth discussing. And the person who drew the short straw to join us to discuss this is White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Yamiche Alcindor, who has a look on her face who says, "I've done some crazy stuff in the last 2 years, and this ranks right high up on the list of crazy stuff," that we're about to analyze that conversation.
So can I just ask, because you do cover the White House, are you going to be calling Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, and asking her if we have a problem with our schools, not in our flawed education system, but if it's just too boring?
Yeah, they said there's no ADD, it's just people are bored.
School's too boring, because that is the narrative that the President of the United States just allowed in our Oval Office.
I will not be calling Betsy DeVos, but it was truly a bizarre moment, and mainly because what we see is a complete transformation of Kanye West. This was a rapper who's not only is his music really something of a rallying cry for African Americans, and he's really a conscious rapper, but this is also a rapper who said George Bush doesn't care about black people at the height of when people were criticizing President Trump's handling of Hurricane Katrina because so many African Americans in New Orleans felt abandoned by the federal government and the White House. Now you have him using specific stereotypes that have been overused about African Americans. He talked about the fact that black people have been using welfare, that there aren't fathers in the home. Of course, we know that those things are just patently false, and that Kanye West was really talking about all this stuff and really not making a lot of sense in front of President Trump. It was a truly bizarre moment.
Okay. But how do you think it's going to impact the president and or his supporters?
He says that Kanye is really good for him with African American voters.
I don't think that Kanye West is going to help him at all get any more votes from African Americans. I think the people that already like President Trump are going to look and say, look, Kanye West is someone that African Americans have championed, who say that this is someone who they've really, really looked at and said that this is a star of rappers. They're going to be able to look at this and say, hey, look, there are clearly some African Americans who like President Trump. Just look at what Kanye West said about him. So I think for his base, this will just make them feel better. But I think for African Americans, just looking on Twitter and getting some of the text messages that I'm getting, people were appalled that Kanye West did this. And black people are smart enough to know that just because Kanye West is an African American man, that doesn't mean that you're going to follow him and follow what he's saying. I mean, you can say that again with Herman Cain. There were people who said, okay, Herman Cain's an African American man. That means that black people are going to vote in droves for him. And we just didn't see that. So I don't think that this helps the president at all with African American voters.
But it's more than just having an unconventional approach or a different voice in the White House, because President Trump did say things on the campaign trail that some found offensive, but he said to some people in the south side of Chicago, the system is failing you, Democrats are failing you, what do you have to lose?
Said it in Detroit.
Some people said that was offensive, but some actually said, you know what, the system is failing me, maybe I will give you a shot. But what Kanye West did right there was no clear message. I mean, this is someone who actually sat there and said, I have been diagnosed bipolar, which if we're going to address mental health issues, let's please do that. Let's not exploit someone in a position like that, because it is unclear what his message or his goal was at all there. I mean, to say we're not going to talk Make America Great Again because time doesn't exist. This is our White House.
I mean, Stephanie, you've already generated more analysis of this than my brain is possible of doing. So I'm just going to.
It was too boring. I guess you didn't like school.
No, it was fascinating. Even the president got stunned at one point, Yamiche, where he said he was sort of speechless. But
I will just, if I could say one really quickly, it is that African American conservatives are very frustrated with this White House because you have someone like Kanye West speaking for African Americans. There are hundreds, I would say, of black Republicans who would be happy to sit with the president and talk about the policies, talk about the economy, talk about it in a very coherent way, and make the case that African Americans should vote Republican. But the president isn't doing that. Instead, he's filling the White House with Omarosa, with Kanye West, with people who black Republicans say do not at all represent their needs.
What does that argument actually look like, Yamiche? If there were a real effort to speak to black Republicans and or black conservatives, right? There are black conservatives who may not identify as Republicans, but they hold conservative views. What would that conversation have looked like if that was what was actually going on? The president trying to say, let me appeal to more African Americans in a sensible way.
I think that conversation would look like, let's talk about the economy. Let's talk about whether or not African American employment is something that has helped not just in numbers, but has helped specific communities. Let's talk about those cities like Detroit, maybe like Chicago, not in a way to say that these are places where Democrats have failed, but say, let's look at the positive plans that we have for these cities. And it would really say, let me look at my cabinet. I want to have more African Americans employed at the White House, which means it's not just talking about diversity, it's actually including people of color in your White House. The president has not done that.
Yeah, and there was this conversation seemed to veer for moments down that road. There was a conversation of Kim Kardashian and Alice Johnson, who had been released from prison after a life sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. And then Kanye talked about somebody who he also thought was sentenced for too long. They talked a little bit about urban development in Chicago and bringing jobs in. So it had hints of going down that road, and then it just went off the rails.
Well, he also, it sounds like he wants to take this opportunity to talk about stop and frisk to the president. Kanye doesn't like it. The president articulated earlier this week he does. I just wonder how much the president listened to and what his takeaway will be. You know, Kanye was talking about great companies or brands. He's talking about Levi's. Levi's has taken a stand against Trump policies on gun control, on LGBTQ, on immigrants. So I'm going, Levi's, that's certainly not in the president's
I wonder
lane.
what Adidas is thinking about this performance and their relationship with Kanye West. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.